Hello everyone, today we talk about Vedic religion and more specifically of the spiritual parabola that the Indo-Aryan beliefs had, in fact, in the Indian subcontinent historically throughout the millennia. It's not the first time I discuss Vedic religion. We talked about it in the Indo-European Holy War video and in the Indo-European Sacred Fury one, etc., but never dedicated a single video to it. And as you know, it's a huge topic. Today, for example, we'll not address specifically the Mahabharata, the relation between Krishna and Arjuna that we discussed here and there. Recently, I made a question and answer video that was addressing specifically that as an example regarding, in fact, grace in the European religion, in the universal tradition. Today we look mostly at the basic, comparative Indo-European, outlook of the Veda, and of again the rise and fall, in fact, of these religion, or at least the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man, and thus the relation specifically between the Brahman and the ātmā, how the as you know, enormously complex set of Hindu currents, right, came to identify some principles. We're talking essentially of a submerged religion more than else, because throughout the millennia, many of the original meanings were branched into a series, in fact, of intertwined figures between Uranic and Chthonic, etc. It's a fairly well reconstructible path, but there are lots of figures that are also subject to debate. They have essentially an ambivalent function. Think about Shiva, for example, that seems to have, even though being part of the Hindu Trinity with Brahma itself and Vishnu, also has an important Chthonic background, probably a pre-Aryan one, and this is valid for many other deities, of course, that rose prominence. Think about Kali. We can identify her clearly in the great Black Mother, say, of the dark forces. Again, provided even in there with some positive ones, but in this regard we should make a story, of course, of Hinduism, which is complicated, but it's obvious that this transcendental dimension in great part was denied. You can claim that Hinduism, at least at the core, kind of operated level, is the closest, and as a matter of fact, for this reason, more traumatically brutal, fierce, aggressive, and splendid and glorious Indo-European religion. It's properly the strongest, but it's the model mostly also comparatively for our understanding of the Hellenic, of the Roman, of the Norse mythologies and beyond, at a scale that, as you know, in the Indo-Europeistics encompasses dramatically the entire spectrum. We will draw naturally some parallelisms between some figures and others. It's particularly evident for Indra, right? The rest is somehow more complex, but because of the greatness and this fundamentally Chthonic, almost Pelasgian nature of the same India, that truly had lots of connections also with the Middle East, with the same Mediterranean, and of course regarding the Indo-European invasions, it was a, similar common substratum, but not only, also in post-Aryan times, there was all a religious history that is, after all, mirroring in part the trends that we observed also in Europe, also in the Middle East. We never talked about the Persian religion. We could make this next time, but it's as if the relation towards grace, divinity, transfiguration, etc., followed a very similar path in India to, say, Europe, and how people look at religion, specifically at Christianity. You can argue in part also Islam, just to remain close in space, but in a way that we have explained countless times, how at least it is essentially just a different degree of declination or take on the original common universal religion. We will see it also for the Americas. It was pretty much the same, right? The Mayan cycle, I don't know, it is very similar to the Jewish one, for example. And so, as you know, it's something that also goes beyond the Indo-Europeans, that surely left this radical trace. Today we look at India specifically, but that surely was was part of a dichotomy that you can spot even in the other cycles, also in the Semitic ones and so on. So these rises and fall, and these different attitudes towards the sacred. There's surely a lot to tell. A little spoiler, we will talk also about Buddhism. As a matter of fact, we will probably not make another video about it. If anything, it's more likely that we'll start kind of a series on its own to describe essentially what that was. But even in that case, we can see Buddhism essentially as a reaction to the increased ritualistic formalism of Hinduism at some point in its history. It's a sort of rejection, a bit like the Stoic one, and even the sophistic one, at least the first sophistic with Socrates, etc., to the relaxation of the awareness, in fact, of God in Greece, right? I made a video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization in this still kind of Indo-European perspective. I made a couple of videos on that, telling the truth, and we will come back on Hellenic religion too. But let's stick to India specifically, that in ancient times, just to start very freshly, was called the Āryāvarta, that is to say, the land of the Aryans, literally. So Varna is a term designating eventually the caste of the rulers, of the conquerors, but also means color, right? In Sanskrit, it has this root verb that means literally to cover, to envelope, to count, to classify, to consider, to describe, to choose. And in the Rig Veda, it means specifically color, outward appearance, exterior form, figure, or shape. Especially form is crucial because, of course, there was a very strong biological connection together with it, as we will see. Colors dominate this hierarchy in the Hindu system, as you know. That is, the slaves, right, which was opposed to the caste of the Indo-Europeans, the race of the twice-born, the Devas, right, so those who had been born physically, but also spiritually, because they had managed to establish this connection with the divinity, was called also, in fact, black race, Krshna-varna, right? So the slaves, the pre-Indo-European populations, the ones that had been, again, in Vedic India, in the entire Indo-European history, at least as far as we can document, the most systematically and brutally subjugated, right, and properly, so to this day, because castes in that sense remained throughout all the millennia. Think about this, because the Vedas do not even leave even an archaeological trace, right? That's how archaic their hegemony was. But culturally speaking, and this is true for basically also Europe, they left essentially a dominant trace, right? They essentially managed to Aryanize the local culture to the point of keeping it set, right? Even, especially in a system like India that is huge and that is populated, as you know, it was at the time in an incredible fashion because of the endemic concentration of Indo-Gangetic plain, but also the entire subcontinent, etc., was still impressed, right, in so deeply to still maintain the difference. And so the Sudras are the black race, the Krshna-varna, also the inimical race, the enemies, the Dasa-varnah, and the demonic one, the Asura, that, as you know, are a bit like the giants, the Titans, these chthonic forces that, like in the rest of Indo-European religion, Urano-heroic cycle, as you know, come to to win, right? To establish a world order where in this case the Asura are below, and the Arya, the noble one, are above, right? And in all this, we can definitely see also the memory of a spiritual difference existing between the two races that originally clashed, and quite powerfully so, as it seems, because one thing that makes the southern Indo-Europeans, let's say, more ideologically defined, even though they, again, mixed with populations very often were much larger, right? This is true. Look at also, in fact, tectonic reminiscences in Hinduism, but also in the Hellenic religion, the Roman one, etc. But that had the better, in this case, actually of India, the best definition of what the hierarchy was, right? But and together with that, the sense of greater accomplishment of the same noble mission, right? The divine one. In the case of India, let's say that the system that the Indo-Europeans came to rule over was so huge that indeed what we see today as the result of the conquest is again, it has this hypertrophic form that, in which you can understand how powerful the tectonic dimension remained, right? But the fact again that there is still a hierarchy, a superior authority, and that the entire system that at the time was one of the most original, chronologically speaking, right, in Indo-European history, remained, tells you how strong it really was. What is fascinating, in fact, about the Vedas is that the sense they came to rule in, say, earlier times, right, or from, say, some of the closest regions, right, one of the least unmediated ways, right, in fact, much more military ones in the Indian continent, right. So we are talking about a history of conquest and a brutal clash, right, also of resistance by the previous Teutonic forces, and that of the higher caste, the one of the conquerors. The most historically based myth of this conquest, apart from its metaphysical implications, is the one of Indra. So the one of Jupiter, the one of Zeus, of Perun, it's the same figure of the king of the gods, of the devas in this regard. And so you immediately understand what the point is with our term of Zeus, Deus, Jovilius, Julius, by the way. So it's the same etymology of the twice born, or the divinely born as well. So when we look at the gens Julia, and as we were saying yesterday, by the way, how this affirmed that it would be the gens Jovilia fundamentally. So the twice born, the one that was able to invert the cycle of decadence, representing the golden age in the West, with Augustus Sevastos, the Venerable. Well, you realize here we're talking about essentially the same figure, a royal one and a divine one at the same time, sacred one. This aspect in Hinduism is deeply felt, right? Because in many ways we observe more directly since the beginning how this Indo-European offspring concentrated in the same kings the sacral functions, right, as ancestrally when documented also in Europe, that eventually was split, right? And we can document even the latter aspect, in fact, better, as if there had been an investiture struggle in India, right, even still in Vedic times, in the latter phase. So the god Indra, whose symbolism is, of course, the thunder. He rides this white elephant, symbolizing, of course, divine power. And, of course, we've made lots of videos about Indian warfare showing how important heroic culture was among those peoples, and how the elephant, even this regard, represented the dominated, subjugated forces, the wildest forces of nature that embodied the same asura, right? So the lesser race of the slaves, the subjected, that in fact in the Indian manuscripts, in the illuminations, also very late in time, you can see are basically of animal form, in part, right? They're half men, half animals. This is the same concept of the myth of the Minotaur, which exists in India, by the way, right? As in fact, Rudra, right, is this Vedic deity associated with Shiva, as a matter of fact, that blends kind of Uranic and Chthonic forces within it, because this was probably the major deity of the pre-Vedic reality. So he's the deity of wind, of storms, of medicine, the hunt, also of Vayu, that is yet another say declination of the same figure. And Shiva is part of the Trinity, is the destroyer, right? So even in this divine order, originated with Brahma that creates, then Vishnu that preserves, and Shiva that destroys, the latter, of course, is connected with the essentially the pre-Aryan background, right? That also is connected again with these say natural physical knowledge of the underworld. Is a bit like I don't know, Athena, that is also ruling over serpents, right? As Saint George the Dragon. It's always the same concept that you cannot come to acquire power without action, and action of rule and conquest over these demonic forces, right? So it's important to point out, because the Minotaur literally figures in the same way, and it embodies, of course, the fallen kind from properly a physical point of view, as a degeneration of the original divine stock that made this man essentially being also more looking to like animals compared to the conquerors, and acquire all this negative racial semantics, as we've seen with the Krshna-varna, the Dasa-varnah, and so on. The same is true for Indra, that is the hero that fundamentally manages to affirm this virile, sacred, royal authority over the chthonic, feminine, quasi-Pelasgian comparative cult of the subjugated, the pre-Indo-Europeans. He was born despite his mother's wish to the contrary. For example, consider that Indra is related with the Brahma as well, right? So the ultimate reality underlying all the phenomena in Indo scriptures. You can argue that everybody is by a degree, but of course there is a privileged connection, solar symbol, and so on. And the mother didn't want to have him born, and eventually she abandoned him. But he still manages to survive. Anyways, there is something here, or almost Romulian, of course, in symbolism, as Indra will have naturally a glorious path. Indra has a luminous and heroic divine myth, right? He manages to exterminate the multitudes of the black Krishna. So he is the embodiment of the same Indo-European conquest. And in this, he even manages to defeat the Dasu, so the dawn goddess who wanted to ascend to heaven, right? So as if to say that this force was not enough to substitute to the Uranic principle, by also bringing with her all these dark forces. This is literally the storm of the Asgard, by the way, except, of course, Indra manages to defeat these forces. Consider that Indra eventually in the mythology is still inferior to the Brahman, in a sense, because at least in some, say, currents of Hinduism, the world is created and destroyed countless times. This is actually still a sort of Platonic way of looking at the world, a relativistic one, right? Of course, the Indo-Europeans conferring a much more absolute affirmation of Indra's victory and establishment and system. Because as we will see, in fact, the same locals come to challenge the initial principles. And ever since India, in that sense, degenerated in an ever more Platonic, deterministic direction. In spite of maintaining this ultra-traditional beliefs, but that proves pretty well, like, as how old traditions in the world are nothing if they're not substantiated by the moral force, the acknowledgement of the absolute value of the Brahman in that case, and the difference with the ātmā, as we will see in the end, which in fact is being denied, especially by some currents of Shivaism, not surprising, because those were the bearers in great part of the chthonic elements of the deity. Right, so for all, I'm not talking about India now specifically, but I've had people, I realized from some places in the world that look at in my country it's better than the West because we have tradition here. I don't know any country in the world where tradition actively maintained the transcendental awareness of the sacred, and without that we're just talking about fallen cycles. It's as if you were speaking from the ashes of a flame, right? There is hardly any pride in this sense to come from, first of all, from anywhere in the world nowadays, considering how we approach religion, or better, not approach it. And we are at the end, probably, of a much greater cycle than we think. But in this sense, no, it doesn't just to claim traditionality, to claim any accomplishment. That's also why the Vedic religion and Hinduism deserve a lot of attention in their historical becoming. Naturally, as we were saying, Indra tops this kind of, in fact, king of the gods role, right? Who, in the process, conquered ever greater territories, right? Just imagine this, essentially, Central Asian populations swarming, as it happened, in fact, many times eventually in Indian history, in this, again, enormous, just a word on its own, the Indo-Gangetic plain, especially, a subcontinent that we call as such, incredibly fertile. Remember that this was the dream of Alexander, this was the dream of Augustus, so India embodied, in this regard, the top prey in this kind of virile, northern, warlike kind of quest for domination. This is the point. And it would have made a lot of sense politically and strategically, right? And I would like to add that in the histories, of course, of the various peoples that, as you know, came to rule India later, think about the Indo-Scythians and so on, so all peoples that fundamentally came also from that kind of Indo-European background, and were somehow reliving thus what the Veda had accomplished at some point in history. Of course, leave the same exact models. Again, changed through the process of modernization and secularization already in those times, already after more than a millennium after the Vedic settlement, but still with the same universal principle that was still well alive. In fact, the Aryans in this process are known as the white companions of Indra. Here, again, the Indo-European model of the retinue of warlords, right, from the Ver Sacrum to the Comitatus to the Fianus, is the same identical thing. These were effectively the military caste also that came in the settlement, in the social stratification in India, to be separated even from the royal power that from which, of course, all derived in a way or another, because, of course, that principle of transfiguration means that at the end of the day, the direction is the Brahman, right? And so the absolute, in a way, from which these people somehow emanate, also metaphysically, right? And this all has surely a historical meaning. The emphasis on all these spaces, the conquest, live deeply in the myth. And it's not just a myth, right? Because these were probably also long-term processes, as you know. Also, Europe was not conquered in a wave, right? There were several waves also, kind of. Yeah, of course, it was a moment of greater intensiveness, but of course, people kept moving, doing things. So, as for what happened in Europe later, you understand that, as we were saying before, that the cultural hegemony of the conquerors came to inebriate the same subjects that at some point began to feel as part of this filiation of some sort. Finally, in the feats of Indra, who fights against the serpent Hari and the dreadful warlock Namuchi, they're probably also embodying, as you understand, the legendary ancestral struggle of the Devas against the Asura, so the slaves. You realize this clash. There are different foes at a time. This is typical of India specifically, this hypertrophy of any kind of living form, massive demic base and full of resources, and that's also, think about the armies even that these conquerors were able to put in motion that took several different forms. You can see it beautifully in the various Indian civilization and arts, etc., just like in Greece, like what we mostly appreciate of those civilizations in a modern secular sense is, look at how beautiful the figurative arts are, as a matter of fact. But that actually is the measure of the decadence. It's the measure of the fixation, say, with the image per se, and the distraction from the action, right? So the passage from a will of power, if you want, to a more contemplative, intellectual dimension. In the fulguration of the goddess of the dawn that we were saying before, who wanted to be great, you also see this imperial domination, right? The idea that also lesser, even still light forces had to be subordinated to the highest one. And this could mean naturally a lot of things within the same pre-Aryan background, right? It surely had some trace of Uranic, dimension. We've seen it before with Rudra, etc. So those were all peoples that we have. We can see definitely much more tonically based, and where surely the balance was shifted toward that direction. But it was symbolism of that kind. Naturally, everything is lost in the fog of philology, of the fact that we cannot reconstruct any history here, but just a myth, right? But we know it happened for real. And finally, there is the destruction of the demon Urtra, right? And of his mother, by Indra, of course. So the Vedic Urtra is just the great universal snakes that fundamentally prevents the symbol of evil and of fear and of paranoia and of a sort of chain, right, around the human potential that Indra breaks, right, because he introduces the Brahman, and the Devas are, of course, carriers of this knowledge. And in fact, in that moment, you have properly the generation of the sun and heaven, symbolizing the order change at the moment of the conquest. So this was the foundation of the Uranian heroic solar cult. We find mythical events that may contain allusions to the struggle between the same cult of the Indo-European conquerors against this demonic and magical, but in the lesser sense, in the chthonic sense. We'll have to talk about magic, because there is properly a white and a black magic, and this is exactly also how some branches of Hinduism fundamentally bear witness as having elevated part of that chthonic magic to some kind of higher level. Also purification through the same light one is still mixed in some way, because they always are. You cannot have one without the other, right? You cannot accomplish a conquest if there is nobody to conquer. That's the actual point. And we're talking naturally of the aboriginal cults of the Dravidian people, that is essentially Paleo-Malayan races that inhabited India. And you know there that, of course, the north was the most important part of the country, the most resourceful. The south was instead kind of like where the barbarians lived. But you have to imagine during the conquest, naturally many warlords like pushing further south, right? A bit like what happened in Europe. Like the best land was, of course, actually in that case in the south. And you see in religions like Norse, the Gaelic ones, this greater presence of the darkness, because that's where, in the colder areas, in the less populated areas, that kind of the effort to conquest had been somehow maybe greater in relative terms, but lower in absolute terms, also less effective. And so you see more commixture, right, between the various the two cults. And that's also interesting shifts in balance there. For example, the difference between the eagle and the crow, right? That is, you may point out it's just iconographic in a sense, yes, but it always points out it's the same, it's still the bird, right? And it still has that connection with the deities, etc. It depends, however, which ones we're talking about, because the eagle is the sun, the crow is the chthonic underworld, right? But they still have the same meaning at the same time. Now, there is, in popular epics in India, also the mention of a primordial solar dynasty, which is called, in fact, properly Surya, which stands for sun, just like Latin sol, English sun, etc. And Vamsa, in fact, bloodstock, whatever, dynasty in this case, narrowly meant, that allegedly triumphed in the subcontinent after it destroyed specifically a lunar dynasty instead. So the symbol of the Great Mother, of the forces of the night, and so on. So what you find also beautifully, in Hellenic mythology, and think about Theseus that is saved by Apollo and Athena fighting the Erinyes, the Furies, and so on. So there is properly the memory of this regime change and all what it entailed culturally. There is the story of Parasu-Rama, that is the sixth avatar of Vishnu, in the form of a hero wielding the northern axe, right? So something you can't find in all this kind of northern world, broadly speaking. It's just like Thor's hammer / axe, in fact, like the Roman fasces, and so on. It's the same identical thing coming from this hyperboreal north, in fact, where the eternal light lives. And remember that Vishnu is the preserver, right? So this hero has properly the task of mitigating the order by keeping unavoidably the darkest ones down. Of course, in this Vedic mythology, and as you know, in Hinduism, it's plenty of bloodbaths, of repeated numbers, all the numerology. You know that India, for having to deal with this enormous masses and so on, developed also at least the numerals that we use today and so on, because there is this cyclicity that is all, in fact, chthonic in part, but began to say, this guy crashed for 21 times this group of peoples and so on. And you understand properly the waves of peoples, of rebellions, of of these inhabitants had to be kept down, right, in the order. We have seen it many times also in the videos about Indian warfare in much more recent eras. And in this particular case, just to explain you how difficult and committing it is to maintain the order, Parasu-Rama exterminates, as I was saying, 24 times the rebellious warrior class that essentially wanted to usurp the ultimate principle of power. This happens in an era that would correspond to the Silver Age, so the second one. In fact, the second step from the first step from the Golden one, and the fall from the Golden Age, in this case known as Treta Yuga, in which, at least according to the sacred texts, the Indo-Europeans lived still in a kind of inhabited northern region, and were yet to actually undertake the conquest of the subcontinent from the northern seat, right? And we're essentially paving the way from a spiritual point of view to the race of the Brahman, right? So this would even speak, of course, of the internal struggle within the same people and within the same hero too, against the forces of evil. That is, as we've seen, typical of the Indo-European holy war. Consider that in Veda, the Hari, the Āryāvarta, means in fact not just the noble one, but the golden one. All these deities are blonde, right? Blonde gods, like Apollo, like Horus. This is quite interesting because you see that even this is nothing to do with a specific, say, the mythology of a specific ethnicity. Even in Egypt, actually, there is the point that this divine race had emerged with those splendid characteristics. So in this ancestral lost mythological memory, something having happened originally at some point. In fact, the same Vishnu is called the Golden God, right? And this specific reference to the blondness, the red-hairedness, it's something you find in all the Indo-European onomastics. The Roman one is full of those, right? How many Roman gentes refer to the blonde hair, to the red hair, to the blue eyes, to the tallness, it's to the whiteness in general. So I think this is deeply important, even to recover in an etymological sense, because we literally have these names ourselves. At least I don't, because I have the one of a Indo-European totemic animal. It's also a surname of an Indo-European totemic animal, as a matter of fact. But the principle there is always present. And Vishnu, in this occasion, which is called the Golden God, destroys the Mlekas. That is to say, the degenerated warrior stock that had fundamentally betrayed the sacred, wanting to usurp the royal function of the Divas gods. And I think etymologically the connection with Lucifer, he who brings the light, here is meaningful, because the Divas, as we've seen, were the second born, so they brought the light themselves, and God had to essentially crush the most dangerous of these ones, because they had their altering the order. So they had essentially calling to question the authority, the rationality, the intelligence of the leadership, and they had ended up unavoidably crushed at these higher levels. So this is interesting, of course, because it shows how the hierarchy is never like, okay, this is for ethno-nationalists, for, say, there is this stock, this race, and they're always good and brave, and okay, no, evil, and the worst one, actually, is present in the heart of all men, right? And and in the moment in which you pretend to have any kind of merit just for doing nothing, but being part of a race, fundamentally, you basically betray the universal order, because it means that you're not capable, say you're all tall, right, and no actual no actual hero that would just act without having to claim that. This is valid for everyone because we all do it by some degree, but at least I try to explain it, not pretending without merit, let's say. And so the themes that allude to the overcoming of sort of the generated forms, not the substance. This is also another particular aspect of the reaffirmation, restoration of a heroic type. In India, is quite strong because at some point the confusion between the Atman and the Brahman is being carried out in a sort of kind of almost pantheistic way. It's in fact that we also identify India religiously, traditionally, like it's actually the denial of the original principle, right? And so what matters is not the reincarnation, but actually the form of it. In fact, as we will see, the actual Orthodox scriptures say that whatever reincarnates is actually a lesser form of the being, is the desire. It's a lesser. This thing existed also in Roman religion, right? So banally, there were lots of deities that remained also after death. Think about the dei Mani. Well, yeah, those were important figures because they were chthonic powers fundamentally that had remained connected with the hero's body, but the soul had transfigured imperially. So, in other words, those were deities for the plebs, for the lesser people that, however, felt still that power was strong enough to keep them at bay in a way or another. So the superstitious nature, again, the chthonic element always maintains. And this is present in all the Indo-European mythologies. So every people was making some kind of self-criticism regarding who's the actual hero and who is actually just a loser of some sort. Because, of course, the sense of identity, of belonging, was extended to the people, to the natio, to the part even to the populace, right? But the concept was, of course, always connected to the divine medium, who was the same imperator, at least in the case of Rome, for understanding each other, and that was not instead just, in fact, to be given for granted because just you are born among that people. And that's why you can't have even properly. I was asked, but as a nationalist, I think people shouldn't mix. There is no Indo-European trace of identity if you do not want to conquer and ingravidate and subjugate and bring everything back to the unity in that regard of the world. Nationalism goes in the perfectly opposite direction, and it doesn't have any form of form specifically of tradition in it. It's a radical leftistic ideology of which people should be ashamed of themselves. And surely the Indo-Europeans would have been ashamed for such a concept, which seemingly is very hard to understand nowadays because, of course, nobody approaches anymore this kind of ideas. In any case, in historical India, we find traces of a modification that was probably due to the imposant substratum of native vanquished races. Right? Again, lots of people that always created a problem to any ruler who tried to centralize in India. Right? And that kind of always failed in the end, in fact. That's why there was such a great obsession, even from the West, for India, because it was like the ultimate prize in antiquity, right? To dominate, to subjugate. And as I was hinting at before, you have this Indo-European conquering base, and then even in Hinduism, as you know, a subsistence of virile asceticism and heroic fulfillment. But how this was diluted brought essentially tectonic forces actually to gain the upper hand. In fact, what happened in India was first of all the split of the heroic Uranic royal authority in something that we see in the West having been accomplished fundamentally by the late Roman Empire. Is properly the separation. Say the Byzantines actually lived on with that concept, but also weren't able absolutely to keep them alive, whereas paradoxically the Romano-Germans managed to do so, and that's why we're talking about, of course, the end of the cycle was with the end of Western Rome, with Rome proper, in a sense, but in part that's also why kind of the Europeans got it, especially during the modern, the contemporary era. This thing was crystallized and ritualistically sclerotized. In India, what you have, like in something that, as I was saying before, is more resemblant to the investiture struggle, is the separation of a royal dynasty and a priestly class of sorts. So the fact that that there would be a contemplative priestly dimension, similar to what you find in the West with the Christian church, again, is not responsible for it per se, because in all these cultures there was a blend of the two things. This is a universal fall and sin, right? The split between empire and church is not the fault of the church, because if you are an emperor, you find somebody contending your power and you lose. You're not an emperor anymore, or at least you are much degraded in that regard. And the church had also military power, as you know, so that popes like Boniface VIII claimed literally to be Caesars for that matter. So you understand how in Romano-Germanic Europe that mentality, however, that the empire was still leaving was strong also among the church. The same thing can be said for India, where also the priestly class had an important power on its own that could wield in practice and that could embody the imperium. But it was separated again from the king. And in fact, there is a huge debate, as you know, in Indo-Europeistics regarding the fact of the so-called Indo-European tripartite order, and say, but is it true that there were things like, just the priests, just the warriors, just then the slaves? No, because the ultimate principle was a unitary one, right? There is just God that rules in practice, and so what we all became with this kind of different arrangements is the measure of a fall of the divine race that we would be still partially, but continuing to degrade and eventually to dissipate ourselves, to eliminate, to cancel ourselves. It is true that India took a very important, turn in that kind of more chthonic dimension, right? Everything turned into a superstition, as we will see. Even Buddhism, that in practice was a reaction, as I said, and we will see better now, to this decadence, and started exactly from this idea of transcendence, of kind of coming back to the unity from the Buddha, who was, by the way, a military. He came from a military caste. Bear in mind. So for all those people who think, no, because Buddhism is so peaceful, man, it's just about the Eastern spirituality and we are evil Westerners. That's the kind of radical underschooling that we have witnessed, especially since the 1970s onwards. But Buddhism, as you know, paradoxically turned in the hyper-polytheism. Right? Today, Buddhism largely is, again, won over by the chthonic superstitious forces that have, a statue of Buddha and worship that, and it's their local religion. So with probably no idea what the hell it is, universal power, divine rule, a linear view of time, etc. Paradoxically, Jainism, that was born still from within instead a decayed Hinduistic dimension, went towards kind of a greater principle of the absolute by trend, but still they're pretty fallen realities. as well. So the period of greater tension extended to the time of Vishwamitra, one of the great Indian sages, let's say, that however still lived in a sort of mythical time, so that he had some power himself, because again everything was based on such transcendence. So there are various currents that refer to how eventually these acts, those were to be interpreted and so on. We don't have time to digress. But the core point here is that Vishwamitra incarnated the regal and priestly dignity at the same time, right? It's like the Roman Rex originally, that whose ultimate power was eventually lost in practice because of unfitness, whereas the first Romulus, as you know, had transcended, right? He had returned to God. So Vishwamitra exercised his authority over all the Indo-European stocks in this mythical time living in the Punjab region. In the following period, in which instead we are in the early Vedic times, just to make you understand, in the later Vedic times, when the Gangetic plains were invaded, there was already kind of a division. So it's a sort of upper and lower phase, where the conquerors had began to expand, to dilute and to soften, right? Because they had seized power, and what they do, we got it, so we're actually living here. So now you haven't become that yet. You're actually starting to soften up, and bad things occur, including more war and so on. Now, the authority that the priestly caste acquired in India can be easily compared to what happened to Egypt, that also was founded with this absolute principle, and that eventually got so long ago that had this time to deteriorate. A development that can be witnessed by the importance of the Purohita, that would be a sort of imperial chaplain of court, so the greatest priestly figure, next to the sacral king, right? So literally a Brahmana working for the what would be the actual highest religious authority, the king. Instead, slowly acquiring, in fact, as soon as the original dynasties decayed morally, following the Indo-European settlement in India. So what was the consequence of this social? That all these various dynasties that had come to rule India, so literally as a lordly settlement, with a hierarchy, yes, but also in the sense with a split from the absolute principle of power, with a sole overlord, right, that is able to conquer everything. No, there is the split towards the various signories that ruled from, as you know, so the huge latifundia over enormous amount of people. So with an enormous degree of elitism and ambition, that wanted to contend power. The actual formation of a priestly caste, that was actually winking at the chthonic substratum, and it was thus recovering some kind of lunar symbolism. This happened in the Christian Middle Ages also for the Church of Rome in part, right? There are always some sort of chthonic symbols. You find it even in the emperor, like with symbols of snakes, of dragons, right? There is always a dual symbolism. But in India, we've seen it also at the times of Ashoka and so on. What is seen sometimes as just a civilized, progressive appeasement towards the cases actually is one of the greatest hypocrisies ever, that, again, could have been surely employed by any shrewd leader, but that was mostly fighting, in fact, as a sole ruler against the military caste, that was bearing still a closer sense of that military sacredness. This is true also, again, for the medieval West. During the Crusades, there was still the investiture struggle, but the point was the same, right? The cingulum militaris of the knight is technically a proof of sacredness, because technically a knight is the only freeman, right? Whoever doesn't bear arms in that Romano-Germanic tradition is not a freeman. It's something else, and thus if you had to reconnect it brutally to the ancient Indo-European standard, that was actually a slave that was probably not even considered to be able to attain any transfigurative power, right? As opposed to the gods that you can see in how the nobility portrayed themselves. Think about the Roman Senate. Think about the sense of cohesive aristocratic power among the Germanic tribes. That sense also had all lost, as we've seen both in Rome, both anywhere in Europe. That sense that the king had that had a prerogative of any sort. This is very important also, for example, for Germanic history, because it shows you that there wasn't a standard to attain that say what is that the imperator in Rome was monarchically embodied, especially with Augustus, that had for this reason restored the Golden Age. And everything in terms of individual power the senators could have was actually an emanation of Augustus' personal imperium. It's technically even wrong to call it personal, because at that point it's as if at least at his death he had been God himself. And this is very powerful. So in India, this fragmentation emerges immediately because of the centralization of the huge place, the enormous forces that were agitating, competing for power, but also from the original substratum. So what happened practically is that the warrior nobility began to be opposed to the priestly caste in India, right? And Indian popular epos recalls prolonged and violent struggles between these two contendants, who aimed at the control of the entire India, that, as we were saying before, was literally called Āryāvarta, so the land of the Aryans altogether, so what belonged to them, also in a sacred sense, as a sort of non plus ultra, at least as an accomplishment of conquest per se, that represented the world, of course, because to them that was the scale of it. So there was a further division which took place later. As we were saying, for the Roman Church, we see in India that this struggle with the military class brought to the acquisition of virile and regal traits, right? And the warrior caste that was originally called, also bear in mind the Rajanya, so properly the regal one, making understand also how individually they really were, how close they were to divinity, to absolute universal power, to maintain, of course, part of its own spirituality, right? It had not died, right? It would have taken a long time. Still, the case is the military one surely leaves of that kind of legacy in general. In fact, during these wars, mythologically you see that the warrior caste does prevail in at least various instances over the priestly spirituality that, as we have seen, is more chtonically oriented, and through which, of course, we see the modern Indian spirituality again with this lots of chthonic elements all around that you don't even properly understand per se. Think about, I don't know, Krishna, that is in fact by name, which as we've seen means black, somehow bluish dark, right? And there the story goes that he was bit by a snake that had poisoned him and his skin had turned white. So the snake, however, is still the kind of the chthonic force par excellence in some way. So it's as if to say that you can't quite attain divine transfiguration before having passed through the Dionysian inebriation, right, of poison, of the shamanic trance was used, in fact, among all the warrior brotherhoods to achieve, in fact, at least superior status, right, and that brought this further growth, and this is present also in the West very well, as you know. That may be an interpretation, but we don't know, right? At least there is a debate about it. In the warrior spirituality of India, we often find specific traces of that northern, ancestral, Indo-European mark, right? So whenever you look at these characteristics, these traits, you see, for example, a very austere type of the ancient ātmā, that is to say, the Lord of Fire, who first opened the paths through sacrifices, that thus embodied that royal spirituality, summing the military and the religious function. The type of the Brahmana who dominates the Brahman and the gods through his formulas of power, so reaching essentially a sort of divine status, or at least putting himself in consonance with this cosmic harmony that derives from the Absolute. And so the faith that the ritual there is not just a formalistic thing that of course has become in the largely chthonic dominated world, but still bearing in mind how important that core concept of the fire, sacred fire, of the Indo-Europeans really was, also properly as a sense of unity in all the households, in all the identitary expression. Right? The doctrine of the Absolute Self, the ātmā, which is technically the innermost essence of the individual, that is not technically even the soul per se, but it's the self, right? So this full awareness of the absolute transcendent power, and so having acquired what eventually in Buddhism it would be the nirvana in a way, in order to realize, to experience. And that tells you how elevated this tradition was, because you hardly have the correspective, at least so confidently displayed by an individual in other Indo-European religions, where everything is much more mediated in some form, representing in there the generation formally. At least this doctrine of the Absolute Self of the early Upanishadic period corresponds to the impassible and luminous principle of the Samkhya, that is to say, properly, the eternal light. Then there is the virile and conscious asceticism, oriented towards the utter unconditioned, that characterizes also the Buddhist doctrine of awakening, in fact. So the idea that you have to deprive yourself of any concern, of every fear, right? And that's, again, hardly a message of peace, because that's how the warriors achieved divine transfiguration in combat, right? And this was an ascetic practice, in fact, that belonged necessarily, as we've seen, to the military caste. Also because the Imperium was just, of course, mostly of the people who specialized in combat, in fighting, as a caste, or whoever that could acquire it. Also the priests, if they were again, the two things were to overlap ideally, so there is no contradiction in that at all. If not in the fact that the split had occurred in the first place. Then the doctrine of pure action and heroism, expounded in the Bhagavad Gita, which was credited with a solar origin in a regal heritage. So you have an order, the artha, the law, the dharma, that cannot be altered in this system. As unfortunately instead, a great part of Indian spirituality has come to even equate in a sort of pantheistic fashion that instead is thoroughly incompatible with the ancestral faith. Then, of course, we find many other characteristics. For example, the patriarchy and its law, the cult of fire. Think about Agni, the symbolically rich ritual of the cremation of the dead. You find also in an absolute sense of soul bond. For example, the fact that women had to be killed if their husbands died, because their death was to be achieved through some sort of combat, and the completion that the union between men and women embodied made this a soul unit, right? And it had to take over the world, also in this kind of subjugation of the female element. Also, Germanic women were meant to kind of take their lives when their men died in combat. So it's not desperation out of, oh my god, I love this guy so much, It was properly the realization that they were lost as individuals without that bond and transcendental achievement, because if the warrior had been slain and he had not transfigured in the process, the question was, of course, by the way, evaluated by the rest of the community, because here we're mostly talking about mythological times, so in historical times at least nobody claimed, say, among other peoples, that this achievements to be fulfilled properly. If not, again, the ones that came the closest to it were the Romans, indeed, and that's why they developed that cult that was radically oriented towards these values since the beginning. But say, aside from Christ, who also probably was married, there was hardly any other kind of known achievement of sort. There was all, of course, like the Arya, the noble ones, a cult of truth and honor. The myth of the universal sacred sovereign, the Krshna-varna. So here we see very well outlined the two traditional poles of action and contemplation that are closely intertwined and that cannot confer, in fact, a transfiguring power if they're not somehow overlapped. Contemplation in this sense meaning knowledge, right? If you base your life only on knowledge and not on action, there is something wrong with that, because knowledge would have to automatically make you act and vice versa. It's just a virtuous cycle, but you need force in order to make it run, right? So without that, there can't be a higher meaning of any sort, and that's why, living in a world of parasitic lazy asses, I think we have also collectively forgotten what these religions actually meant by saying, no, but I actually work hard. Yeah, I would like to see that compared to a second millennium BC Indo-European warlord, that's a bit a different thing. Now, in India, before the Veda, there was naturally another religion that surely owns those aforementioned chthonic traits and chaos and hypertrophic tropical effusion of animal and vegetal symbolism that had distracted man, at least whoever lived there in the condition towards tradition that existed before, and that remained, of course, in India as one of the most evident elements of artistic and religious expression till this day, right? When you look at any, say, search for any of these figures we discussed today, and you look at the architecture, the statues, and so on, you realize that there is huge. Of course, these were kind of rich places, especially for Vedic times. They could surely materially figure power, but as we've seen, that already meant a sort of self-flattery that was literally embodying as matter the scale of the transcendental failure, because matter is to be understood only as illusory, at least, but say it is real as much as reality is being created literally by default, right? So it's not a compliment, right? Of course, it's beautiful art because we are all habituated to this kind of sensual, slavery, but it's not exactly what the ancient conquerors would have liked to see as an accomplishment of their descendants, right? And naturally, as they conquered the place, they were acquainted with this very strong chthonic forces, developed powerful capacities. These lived on in the veins of Hinduism. For example, the tantric cult in its Shaivite currents, right, is essentially a purification of the previous chthonic cults connected with Shiva, that, as we've seen, has this dual role and entered the trinity of otherwise, more Uranic forces, and was elevated thus also in the doctrine of power, but it's still based on the deification of a woman, for example, which is unconceivable in the Indo-European spirituality, or at least when it is, it's still somehow not. It's still an emanation, like the daughter, one of the gods, right? Which is still complicated because now we can't digress on how this worked, but let's say women were not thought to have a transfiguring capacity of their own, at least. So when you look at Athena, for example, is my favorite goddess, arguably, well, she still is the product of some Pelasgian force anyhow. That was, however, absolutizing that magnificent irrational form by the ancient Hellenes, but it's still, a proof of that blend, right? But in the case of Shiva, there are literally orgiastic elements. It's definitely sort of resurgent pre-Indo-European force that had very few to do with the original spirituality of the conquerors, right? It revolves around the cult of the mother, just as Kali, etc. It's possible that this root encompassed all those features also that in Hindu asceticism have a mortifying character, right? The destroyer, probably Shiva. And thus a denial of the life affirmation right? Also the unitary principle, everything that destroys, in that sense, and doesn't win over to rule and transfigure in the process to reconnect to the divine unity is considered a failure. Actually, also in fact the Uranic heroes as such, and that is disturbingly present in Hinduism. There are similarities between the Mayas and the Sumers in the process. However, there was a very specific conceptual path that broke or incarnated irreparably the Indo-European worldview in India. That is to say, the equation carried out between the Atman and the Brahman. As we've seen, the Atman is technically the real self, right? The innermost essence. This absolute form. It has not to do with individuality. It has not to do with mind. It has not to do even with the soul. So be careful in a traditional sense when you say, I believe in individualism. That's actually a denial of tradition. Right? While the Brahman, of course, is the ultimate reality underlying all phenomena as described in the Hindu sacred texts. So what happens, of course, is that the Atman and the Brahman can become one, but only in the moment in which you talk about God himself. Instead, this in India was interpreted largely in a pantheistic sense, which largely reflects the Chthonic Pelagian feeling. This is to say, like everything that we see is kind of God-man, and we are God, everything is God. And this is sacrilegious, because what we witness at our normal cognitive level and beyond the same knowledge is a degeneration of the divine principle. So it doesn't make any sense, right? In order to achieve the Atman and thus becoming the Brahman, you have to be literally a god, right? As we've seen, Hinduism was also well placed, considering the impact the Indo-Europeans had left in this kind of direct connection, properly with the fire sacrifice, with this overlapping royal and priestly identity, as opposed to other Indo-European peoples when the two things had been separated. It's also true that they also developed in later times, so you can see how the world has further deteriorated yet. Instead, in such a huge continent where, again, the individual was never kind of disciplined to become definitely a hero, the Atman and Brahman difference was denied at some point, and this is atrocious. Right, so Brahman was no longer conceived as in the early period described in the Atharva Veda and in the Brahmanas as this spirit of the literally also formless magical force that is almost a mana quality, right, that dominated the Indo-European and can be directed through the sacred rite. While Brahman came instead to be conceived as, let's say, the one, this kind of absolute entity from which all the life forms proceed and eventually revert to be dissolved again and again. And what does this mean? It means that if you equate Atman and Brahman to the point that basically without doing anything, you're already Brahman in a certain way, right? You deny your spiritual personality. In other words, you think that God is just you say you're part of the whole thing, just per se, so you don't have to do anything. But it's not that anything changes; the thing is accomplished, and so you just go. Thus, whatever you do is okay. right? It's a degenerated, promiscuous idea of reality that is by degree also what it's happened in the Western world naturally in later times, because we said this in India and in other countries immediately say it was much older, or at least, and it had no major attempt, let's say, of inversion, in spite, as we'll see now, the Buddha, etc. There was never, like, I don't know, an Indian empire that said, okay, now we will retake the world because we focus specifically just on Uranic cult. Very often the emperors were actually trying to counter the nobility in the process, because they didn't have enough motivational power, given their standards, to control the whole thing. It was a titanic enterprise, but that's exactly the point. Actually, it should be more than a titanic one. It should be a Uranic, heroic one. So, what does this mean? The equation between Atman and Brahman, the equality of all creatures, communism, the denial of any actual divine power. And this, as you understand, especially in a country where the holy scriptures were, much more kind of open regarding what things should have been done, like, because they were impressed in a much older age, where we can't see properly the spring also of the Indo-European religion, if you want to reconstruct it, caused also a great a rejection or a refusal. Of course, this was everybody's fault, right? But it began to take forms that evidently, especially to the elites, seemed inconceivable. First of all, the doctrine of reincarnation. So this kind of, again, ephemeral reappearance in a conditioned world, in which basically you don't do anything really to want it. It is true. This is called the samsara, right? It is true that the Saint Vedas believed that you can evolve biologically, and so what you actually see in the deterioration of their same people would take place like. But the doctrine, first of all, is not found in the early Vedic period, interestingly enough. It's only later that it becomes predominant, but especially there is no real, let's say, regeneration, if not in a physical sense, right? Your spirit actually is going to be, well, the doctrine says, of course, that you can attain kind of higher levels in that regard, but it is still connected to a sort of external force that you cannot dominate in this cyclicity, right? So you always have, yes, a chance to, in theory, become God again, but it's much more, let's say, repressed, probably from a moral point of view. Like, you're not deciding that. It's just some kind of external force that makes it happen, and you don't have a control on it, whereas you would have been that same force in the past, if you could. Right? And asceticism in this took different forms, aimed at achieving a sort of liberation from the state of affairs, and often failing, because it literally sounded like, okay, like you can see today, many young people also, okay, they say, well, what's your greatest ambition? I don't know, being a paranoid who thinks that the order has to be, that things must preserve the way they are, not even looking at the fact that they are decaying anyway, and the reason is that you haven't done anything to make, to change, to dominate those forces or making the thing change. This is typical, again, of these concepts are very often weaponized by right-wingers, right? The idea, you have to remain all alike, nations must be the same. What are nations? They're not a holy reality. They are the literal product of universal failure, and you want to side with them in an abstract principle for which you're basically doing nothing, just hoping that the world will not change, even if you don't do literally anything about it, if you do not even resume the initiative and pretend to take over the world instead. This is the same thing we see today, right? Also in many ascetic models, people renouncing to riches or things like that. Why? Or wanting to go, like, you have the entire Western civilization want to, my greatest dream is to pick a house in the middle of nowhere so that I can be isolated. But that's what a mentally ill person reasons like. A very fearful, cowardly, paranoid person behaves like. The principle of tradition is conquering as much as you can. And you, by scale, do you realize how inferior our current culture is, and to which kind of lowness humanity has fallen? So a little reference to Buddhism I think is due here, because of course there is an ascetic principle there. As you know, this religion, because it really is, people say, well, Buddhism is not a real religion, man. The fact that you are pretending that, let's say, the form of theism that you have come to know has nothing to do with these universal ideologies, just a measure of your ignorance. Yes, Buddhism is a religion of some sort. You can use whatever other term, but if you understand what it entails, is the same kind of thing of this before, right? If you think that, say, Buddhism is not a religion and Hinduism is, then I don't know what the hell you're thinking. It's actually an attempt to come back to the absolute principle of Buddhism was originated by the prince Siddhartha Gautama, who was an ascetic nobleman from a warrior clan, right? That, just as in very different ways, you can find, I don't know, even in Socrates or in other say philosophical figures that eventually say that as champions, these people were against religion, man, they were so open-minded. They were actually trying to react to the ultra-traditionalist view of what a military imperial religion based on world domination actually was. It's the same old problem. It's ritualistic formalism, right? It's the idea that has also happened in the history of mankind. Like you've just gone with some religion that you do not actually understand anymore. You just repeat some formulas that once were thought to have a very specific purpose that you don't even understand anymore, but you basically start using it as a superstition to think that if you do that, things will go well, except if you're not morally committed to the standards that are not even the ones of once upon a time, but technically of the universal absolute ones, the divine ones, do not have any meaning. That's why the overwhelming majority of people today, or say religious people today, of course, do not even know what religion technically is, and keep doing that in ways that, I don't know, maybe even, of course, conceive some form of strength deriving from those principles, but the broader logic there was properly lost. So ritualistic formalism had surely become predominant in many Brahmana circles. So when you look at the Buddhist doctrine of the awakening, you realize that the ultimate objective is declaring that the view of the identification of the self with this broader nature, so literally with the corruption of the universe to a lesser evil form, and with the divinity, so instead the perfection itself, theistically, the Brahma is, and this is what literally is written in the Majjhima Nikaya of Buddha himself, is quote, an uninstructed average person taking no account of the pure ones, unskilled in the dharma of the pure ones, untrained in the dharma of the pure ones. In other words, what you call like Buddha, such a great man, It's not like this damn oppressive Christians that destroyed everything, because, I've been told in, my Marxist history class, but we kind of liked the East because we self-hated the West, literally says that the average person is shit, including, of course, the people who reason like that, and that they are because they are not Aryans, because this is literally what he says, of course, in the sense of nobility there, but the way it sounds, the other way, of course, would not please most of the people who are fed with bullshit, again, about Orientalism without even understanding anything about these cultures, and that, of course, the Dharma of the pure ones is the law of the Aryans. So, an uninstructed average person, how many times I complain on Schwerpunkt that people are radically underschooled and that they should be prevented even from voting at large as a consequence, because it's exclusively their fault. Because this is what universal tradition says. There is no such thing, even an illness that happens to you, that is not your fault. Because if you start thinking otherwise, you start compromising with reality, and you fall from any standard of any sort. It's just moral relativism. Well, this is what Buddha said, that if you are an undereducated moron, just for all the alleged, as you know, I'm literally a right-winger myself, and those conservative morons that say, you shouldn't study humanistic subjects because otherwise, an average undereducated person with no kind of so this is not pure action. I would like to stress this, that in order to achieve military force, you have to take action. In order to have a religious force, you should have knowledge. So the two things cannot be without the other, and all the aristocracies in the world, literate or not literate, were actually being taught an incredible amount of things, including these ones, right? So, in other words, Buddha says that the world is full of shitty people, and that a new order and rule based on an imperial authority of God and his law should be established. Say this to your next Buddha-loving friend that will tell you it's all about peace and, the evil Western oppressors that actually topped the actual traditional empire in the last 2 millennia and a half, right? Just saying. I like to stress this aspect. So here with Buddha, of course, we're in front of a principle of aristocratic asceticism. You can't be an average moron pretending to sit there like, people do, even paying Buddhist, so-called Buddhist centers, by the way, to make them sit there to meditate and, reaching this other level of understanding, man, it's terrifying. Yeah, without having even read what Buddha said, as a matter of fact. So, with the goal, of course, of an authentically transcendent goal. Now, the fact that Buddha was a military man should also make you understand many things. What did this authentic transcendence serve for? Of course, to become God. Or whatever you want to interpret, like, coming back to it in some way. In other words, to transfigure, right? And to be saved, or to save yourself, depending how you want to see it, which, of course, is always a liminal concept. But because in war, you must essentially not be oppressed by any fear, by any pain, by anything that happens to you, you have to resist to. So this is hardly anything like, you have to understand each other. This is just like you have to man up. You have essentially be able to renounce to everything in order to have everything. Which doesn't mean that you have to be a communist. It means that you have to be a world ruler. And this was the actual purpose of it all. Thus, Buddhism surely represents a sort of reformation occurring in a time of deep crisis of the traditional Indo-European spirituality, It was, by the way, if you look at the timeline, parallel, contemporary at the great crisis that was occurring both in the East and in the West. And surely, as you know, Buddhism largely influenced many other philosophical currents and so on, but they were all part of this dichotomy because there's no boundaries here, there's no categories. This was literally the universal deal, right? Thus, we look at a pragmatic spirit, also a realistic one, right? That wants to push beyond mere doctrine and dialectics without action. A bit like it had happened to philosophical thought in ancient Greece, that again, we think, that's the best thing. Well, of course, it contains a lot of the traditional principles as well, but at some point it degenerated, right? Especially with the second sophistic. One interesting aspect is that in this, Buddhism was even opposed to the traditional doctrine of Atman. But not in the sense that it denied the traditional Vedic one, right? Just the one that at that point the priestly caste had somehow emasculated through, complex theories and speculations, nesting in relativistic directions, which again we can appreciate in a broader sense. Like, want to study that world, study also what these theories were, but just be aware, of course, that they were somehow an unnecessary also extension and complication of a principle that in origin was actually pretty simple at the end of the day, right? You can argue that myths are of course complex, but one thing is just myths, their core concept. One thing is writing having entire schools of thought that overexpand on these things and so on. And of course, part of the myth is also mixed with this, let's call it tradition. Well, Buddha was reacting to it, saying that's a bunch of BS, right? It's just like, again, in Hellenistic philosophy, when people began to question the existence of God, what proof do we have materialistically, mechanistically, coming to deny it, but actually embracing the Dionysian cult. Think about Pythagoras and what he didn't do, actually, in that ultra-religious sense. But again, these have become heroes, let's say, of math, right? Whereas, actually, they were free thinkers, devoid of religions. Pythagoras had literally created a religion styled out of himself, with properly a priestly class, also kind of properly a demonic one, a telluric one, with also female priestesses and so on. It was terrifying, and it was part of that kind of, in fact, Pythagoreanism rather than Dionysianism, but still with this strongly Chthonic materialistic bias. The way Buddhism debunks this whole system is actually pretty interesting. Because, first of all, by claiming that every human being is endowed with an Atman, again, basically have zero standards. So Buddhism, first of all, said this: you cannot be a person who thinks that is fine by being yourself, right? It's the concept of yourself that goes against properly the concept of Atman, which is the innermost essence, not what you have come to be, the generative in every manifestation at all. So reflect this. Equality is not a value. Then Buddhism, of course, denies reincarnation, right? And especially, let's say better, Buddhism denies the existence of a personal nucleus that would be in fact the Atman, remaining identical through various incarnations. I mean, what kind of Atman can it be in absolute terms if it's the Atman of a rat as opposed to the Atman of a human or to one of an elephant, let's say? It doesn't make any sense, just logically, not just traditionally. So what Buddhism actually says is that reincarnation, yes, does exist, but it's not the reincarnation of the self slash Atman, but of the craving, the Tana, that is a lesser expression of it's a degeneration actually of the self proper. Of course, Buddhism realizes that there is a degree of Atman in anyone, but let's say in this sense you have to achieve it to the fullest in order to be Brahman, right? As well, so to match with that absolute perfection. Buddhism also reaffirms Atman as Nirvana. And Nirvana, as you know, is a state that can be achieved very rarely. Also, according to Buddhism proper, through asceticism. But again, an asceticism that is not, again, now I have to think not to think about nothing, right? It's a completely different concept. Again, that's how they ruined the Beatles in the process. It's just this BS. Of course, there's a huge speculation because that's the proof of how unholy all this stuff really is. Making, again, the common idiot believe that you can solve your own problems by essentially not realizing that you are a garbage person and trying to do something with yourself, something decent, right? So again, Buddhism will understand. No, right? And beautifully enough, Hinduism is one of the single most radically violent religions in the history of mankind. Right? It's the other bullshit that India is somehow a peaceful country. What haven't you studied Indian history ever? Like, just a little bit. Right? Most of that is chthonic force, but properly the traditional principle, again, is based on imperial universal domination, which is the core of Western identity. Right? And you cannot escape that. The only way to escape that is to go to hell, literally, right? In tradition and physically, because, what do you think is there after death if you do not manage to transcend your own status? This is the actual point, right? The achievement per se, which is extremely rare. Thus, Buddhism is, literally speaking, of a heroic team of attainment of immortality. And no, you can't, again, as literally Buddha says explicitly, you can't be the average moron and thinking it will work for you. It will never work. As you remain from that background without changing it, without anything. That's what most people go to their graves like. So, in all Buddhism, there is, of course, a limpid echo of primordial divine self-knowledge that was preserved, of course, among the various cases. Interestingly enough, again, a military one like the one Buddha came from, also by the priestly case. I mean, it was present at the time. It's just the degree of degeneration that had made it somehow recognizable, as even more today is evident. And of course, these doctrines did not correspond to an experience of the majority of the people, nor they do it now in Buddhism or Hinduism. This is what old tradition has foreseen. The world will degenerate. It's interesting to see what also later Hindu spiritual currents coped like with this problem, right? And some of them are, in fact, very similar to what happened in the West as well. Throughout the millennium, the relation with religion, the gradual distance from it. First of all, the denial of universal powers, authority, then, in fact, the split of the church. All these things that are a tragedy for humanity. They're not the proof of any modernity. Modernity, if it has anything good, it is because it managed to magnify power at some levels that, however, if they're not understood traditionally, they cannot be used. So again, modernity is not a problem. The problem, as always, is people. The greatest problem for humanity is humanity. And we can look at the Bhakti doctrine of the Ramanuja and the Vedanta doctrine of Sankara comparatively. The latter is the more interesting, the one that, in a sense, remain closer to the possibility of transfiguration. They're a bit just like, I don't know, I know it's a forced comparison, but it's a bit like between Catholicism and Protestantism, respectively. They're both essentially a degenerated view of what also the original message of the same Christianity really was, at least in the way it took practical form, because again, don't think that it is in principle anything different from it. Even again, the changes that Christianity brought to these original ideas of overlapping of the royal and priestly dignity, properly in a temporal and spiritual sense, respectively, are more in practice than in theory. If you literally study the Bible and you understand what's behind it, which is the entire universal religion. So the Vedanta is aware of properly at the end, because it means the end of the Veda. So it acknowledges the problem, the distance between the sacred and mankind having increased, right? There is a trait of intellectualism in the ascetic practices of Sankara, of the Vedanta doctrine of Sankara, which naturally departs from the concept of action that, as we've seen, has to overlap with knowledge. Nevertheless, albeit oriented even there towards kind of an agricultural lunar theme of the formless Brahman, the so-called Nirguna Brahma, to which, all determined forms are nothing but an illusion and a negation of some sort, or a sheer product of ignorance, so the avidya, literally the incorrect, the misinterpretation, etc. Sankara still exemplifies the possibility of transfiguration. It's as if the Veda had stopped at the Silver Age with it, because it acknowledges the distance of the Brahma from people's awareness. It denies its form, so in a way it still denies the world order that tradition required. It's a bit like the soft view of Christianity that tells you, again, whether you are you can make it if you're good somehow, but that doesn't actually tell you that God is meant to be reflected in a hierarchy that is sacred per se. Of course, the church still embodies that, but it still detaches the possibility of saving yourself essentially just by yourself, right? It just, will happen if maybe you will, again, be up to some standards, but that is still God's to decide, and at the end of the day, it's practically impossible to say that you can save yourself by yourself, right? That's why Catholicism is kind of still putting on the table the possibility that works have an importance, right? Why Protestantism properly denied that. It just says that, you don't have any possibility of being a hero. You're just, again, lucky to exist, and God will see what happened to you later, right? So, or at least he has already decided, and you, however, has somehow to still maintain some sort of standard. That's interesting how tradition was maintained for a while. Then you can argue that it's in the most Protestant countries that eventually religious views disappeared earlier towards atheism, and guess why, right? If you deprive the actual universal concept of the connection with the action, it's done. It's just a matter of time before you dissolve into communism. It's pretty obvious. But it's already something here that the Sankara is telling you that there is a Brahman that is beyond people's understanding and that does embody that perfection. The Ramanuja does something different, because he says practically that the human element determines everything, right? So it's a sort of absolute, say, moral subjectivism, and it's somehow similar to something that happened in the Egyptian and Semitic religions at some point. That is to say, the metaphysical distance between human and divine, which in this sense would entail a heroic posture, even if you may think that a hero is fallible still, properly just says, do whatever you like. The deity just manifests in your devotional attitude in practice. And so you can pick a favorite god and customize it as you like. And of course, with, in that sense, a margin of tradition, because the gods are chosen on the base of... It's as if in Christianity somebody told you, like, choose a favorite saint and then make a religion about it for yourself. That's how stupid it is, right? And so it properly inverts. It does go towards the sub-personal. This is the chthonic mass of pre-Indo-European India that basically took over, right? It's not important to have any standard. Just pick any god and manifest him through your own feelings, right? Don't think that there is any standard. That gods exist because there are powerful forces that, in order to overcome, you have to become more than what you are, and to act reasonably, to understand the world, and not just saying, "Oh, it's just how I feel." And that, you understand how bad that is. So we can sum up the two positions, like the Vedanta acknowledging God as a person only at a level of inferior knowledge, meaning you're just too stupid to understand in practice, and so just, deal with your own limits. Just think in the sense that you are a step below divinity and you can never achieve it. In fact, the supreme unity, from which eventually also devotion derives, at least in this sense, in Vedanta is known as the Ekatabhava, right? And it's intended like a father-son relationship, like it's called Pitra-Putra Bhava. Well, Ramanuja in this said, no, it doesn't exist, right? It's even wrong. It's blasphemous and heretic. And you cannot reason like that, right? Ramanuja says that humanity can figure out that the ancient doctrine is unreal, the ātmā and the perception of the distance existing between the empirical self and the transcendental self do not exist. So, however you are, it's fine, right? And it's, again, terrifying. And this thing is followed by lots of people. Then you wonder why also certain things, but let's skip this aspect, happens, right? So Buddhism is connected, as you understand, to the Vedanta in part, in so much that people accuse the followers of this current to be crypto-Buddhists specifically, as there was a principle of metaphysical identification, whereas for the Ramanuja is just no, the physical reality is all in the way we experience it, and so it's just the theism is basically substantiated by humanity. And again, this is utterly terrifying as well, because again, it denies any possibility of transcendence, because it basically claims that you already are in some way, so you can be satisfied for the condition in which you are. So as you understand, we've seen this video. I don't know how it turned out, but I really wanted to make it from a long time, because I think the Vedas are the most interesting of all the Indo-European peoples, religiously wise, because they are the closest to the spring, right? They are the term of comparison for all the others. We have plenty of stuff about them. In Europe, we're not so lucky to have as much as we have in terms of, for the fact what we can reconstruct about the Veda from Hinduistic sources, and yet it's the same religion. Was closely believed after the Indo-European conquests in Europe, right? So we see an evident kind of virile, Uranic, heroic spirituality brought by the Aryans in India, that maintained, thus as a country was informed, like, I mean, it bears the name of this process. So with a traditional spirit that, of course, the country embodies, but that is very doctrinal and not necessarily a concrete, let's say, expression of the original belief, let's put it in this way, that underwent, as we've seen, an incredible degree of degeneration that even is hard to find in other peoples. I don't know, say, about other Asian countries, but let's say it would be interesting to study also in relation to the pre-Vedic religions, mythologies, and thus betraying this enormous, in fact, previous chthonic substratum, re-emerging chaotically or drastically. We know that there was a great deal of evocation, ecstasies, and so on. Again, these were also useful for the Indo-Europeans because, as you know, shamanic trances and so on were used by them as well. Think about the soma. But the soma is a vegetal substance. We don't even know technically what the soma really was. It was employed in sacrifices to induct, as you know, that specific status. In any case, everything used to be read in a metaphysical dimension too, right? It cannot be denied and just say, okay, it's just that plant. No, that's wrong, because it's not that matter is evil. Matter is an accident, and the manifestation of your own shortcoming as such. So it's also interesting, of course, to think about all the studies on Hinduism nowadays, and the fact that there is surely some kind of traditional interest in India. As far as I don't know the country well at all, like I just came to know its history, not even recently. Like when I was a kid, I read the mythologies. I was interested in them, but let's say I never particularly dwelled or researched in them. But the more I learn about them, and the more I understand how important they are, even just for, for the sake of reform of some cultural aspects that, as we've seen, have are surely deleterious in that, especially in the age of the masses, of at least the negative aspects of globalism. Remember that the ultimate point is to take over the world. And so on, but it's basically impossible to pretend that in the 21st century there can be even properly an initiatic attitude towards these doctrines, because we're too distant. We have too much to catch up with in order to properly even approach them seriously. And thus the contemplative element has prevailed. Right, the sacral direction that was radically pointed at by the Vedas has lost its path, if you want. Asceticism is to be understood always in function of action, not of mere knowledge, and the one without the other do not exist. There is an interesting comparison we could trace between the Hinduistic Trinity and the Clausewitzian one, but I will not do this perhaps in another video. And thus, reflecting on the meaning of the inner race of the warrior caste in Hinduism and what it was meant to be, can, I think, be very, very interesting also for understanding more properly the history of European knighthood. And thus, the proper values, the proper characteristics, naturally in a different context. And as I was saying before, also not underestimating the church in that regard, because it's as if, again, in India, this thing arrived earlier and had even a more radical impact than in Europe, but it extinguished itself earlier. It remained in substance, but not in the form. In Europe, instead, we have maintained this idea, in my opinion, in a much more formal way. Up to very few time ago. And although, yes, it was all kind of pretty diluted since especially late Roman times and so on, the question is there something we can learn again from looking back at what was before? Is just what I was talking about before in the previous days when we discussed the reasons, for example, of Roman world conquest, which again cannot be explained in a merely military but forcefully moral and spiritual sense, and the topic of being somehow neglected and or it's kind of, you can't say that. There must be some technical, mechanical reasons you can study in an empirical way. Now, you can't study things empirically, also from a spiritual point of view. And I think it's also much more interesting than the first approach, even if you are not familiar with any of universal tradition. So we will naturally keep looking at different peoples. We'll surely mention Vedic religion in many other videos, because again, the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna is some of the most mind-opening knowledge you can find anywhere regarding the ancestral meaning of universal tradition again. But for today, I will stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.